American police officers are supposed to defend, uphold the Constitution of America. But even if you're not in law enforcement, you have rights and you need to know those rights when interacting with the police. So whether you're in law enforcement or you're not in law enforcement, you don't want to miss this video. Hey, what's going on? My name is Scott and I was sworn in law enforcement for 15 years. I don't know about you, but this incident right here set me off. So I reached out to one of the nation's best when it comes to what he calls constitutional policing. Zachary Miller has worked in law enforcement since 2004, and he's an instructor with the reputable company Street Cop Training. So if you're in law enforcement, this is a good refresher for you. Here's my interview with Zach. What are your thoughts overall on the training police are getting, and then how should it be going forward in your opinion?
Particularly the legal training, I assume you want me to focus on? Yeah. It certainly is. It varies considerably across the country, academy to academy, agency to agency. I mean, every state has the same issues as far as the quality of legal training. Some basic training is really good when it comes to search and seizure issues or constitutional policing. I call it constitutional policing. But then, like you said, a lot of times, actually the majority of the time, we get out of the academy, we do a yearly in-service where we get an update on some statutory changes, but there's no continuing training, continuing education on search and seizure issues across the country. When it does occur in agencies, it's very rare. That's troubling from the perspective of, one, a police legal instructor, and two, someone who takes the oath of office that we took seriously. I take the fact that one of the things we swore or promised to do was uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States of America. But as police trainers and police administrators, we also have that same ethical and legal duty to provide the appropriate and adequate training to our officers. And we certainly, as a profession, I think we fail on that front.
Well, since I have you here, and a lot of my audience is those interested in the profession or those new to the profession, let's make sure they don't lose perspective. So
good, fair enough.
End up on one of these channels like Audit the Audit or We the People University, to which, hey, I mean, if they expose the cops when they do wrong, then, I mean, I think it needs to be said.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I agree with their mission. I don't always agree with the tactics that some of these folks engage in, but I certainly agree with the mission. They're policing the police.
Yeah, well said. Very well said. Yeah. So to help my audience, can you cover Constitution, asking for ID, when someone's supposed to do it, when they're not?
It is pretty straightforward, at least in theory. Application, not necessarily so. But, to demand somebody, well, first of all, we can always ask someone for ID. That's always an appropriate response. But demanding that someone ID, in other words, giving them a command to give me your ID, show me your ID, something along those lines, where we're exerting or attempting to exert our authority, that requires at a minimum of a reasonable suspicion of criminal activity being afoot. So I have to have some objective basis for believing or suspecting that the person that I'm demanding ID from is presently involved in criminal activity, or was recently involved in criminal activity, or is about to be involved in criminal activity, based upon articulable facts and circumstances, things that I can put into work. In other words, I don't just have a hunch or just this sixth sense that there's something going on. I have to be able to point to specific facts and circumstances that I'm aware of that would give me a suspicion that is reasonable to believe this person is involved in criminal activity. Without that prerequisite reasonable suspicion, I can't demand that someone identify themselves in the United States of America.
Someone mouthing off to an officer is not basis for demanding their ID as well.
However you want to look at it, fortunately, unfortunately, you have a constitutional right under the First Amendment to basically say whatever you want to say. It's not illegal to be rude or disrespectful to a government authority. And now there are limits on, obviously, speech that can be criminalized, but for the most part, no. Being rude to the officer, challenging the officer's authority, questioning the officer's authority is not in any state in the country a basis by itself for reasonable suspicion to justify a demand for ID.
I'm very glad I'm interviewing you, Zach, and I'm glad you're clearing things up for anyone who was misunderstanding or anything like that. As of late, the last few years or several years, we've seen people filming a lot of officers, and I still see officers say, stop filming. Can you cover that, please?
It's the First Amendment that's going to come into play. The First Amendment implications of filming a government official in a public area or an area where you're allowed to be. But the lower courts are pretty pretty well convinced, and I think they've made it clear that a person has a First Amendment constitutional right to film a police officer in the performance of his or her duties in an area where that person is allowed to be, which is pretty much anywhere. There's
Right.
a few limitations, but as long as that filming does not in any way inhibit or obstruct the officer's investigation or present a genuine safety concern, apart from those rare circumstances where filming would create that, a person has a right to pull out their cell phone, whether they're involved in the interaction or not with the officer, and film what is going on. It's part of keeping our government accountable. That's the basis for it. The freedom of speech is not just the freedom to say what you want, but it also includes things like recording and documenting things so that you can formulate your own opinions.
The criminal activity is afoot. We are investigating it. What are people's constitutional rights when it comes to the police doing a frisk or a search?
Once we have the prerequisite reasonable suspicion beliefs that criminal activity is somewhere occurring, and we now have a lawful detention of the person is not free to leave, the person suspected, then we typically come to the issue of a frisk, a pat down, a check for weapons, a search for weapons, which is what a frisk is. That's one that's not automatic. Just because I have lawfully detained someone doesn't mean I also have the automatic authority to pat them down and search them for weapons. That requires an additional reasonable suspicion, which is a reasonable suspicion to believe the person is presently armed and dangerous or armed and constitutes a threat, which again requires objective facts and circumstances to make that belief be true. It's not sufficient to say, well, anyone could be armed in American society, or I work in Texas and everyone is armed in Texas. Okay. That I've heard those types of arguments before.
Oh, no.
That doesn't satisfy the Fourth Amendment has what's also called a particularity requirement. We have to have a particular reason why we believe this person is armed right now during this stop. Making general comments about society doesn't satisfy a particularization requirement. So the answer is I've got to have a reasonable suspicion to believe the person is presently armed and dangerous. Then I have the legal authority to conduct a non-consensual, I don't need their permission, pat down for weapons.
Can you cover the actual search?
Sure. The actual procedure. Yeah. So a frisk is a search in the constitutional sense. It is an intrusion upon a reasonable expectation of privacy, but it is a different kind of search. There's numerous types of searches that are covered by the Fourth Amendment. There's community caretaking, there's investigative or evidential searches, and then frisks is another type. There's administrative searches, special needs, those kinds. Frisk falls into a category of what are called protective searches. Now, what makes them unique from some other searches is they only require reasonable suspicion, as opposed to, for example, investigative searches require full probable cause. So a frisk is a search. It's a protective search. It's limited in its justification, only need RS, reasonable suspicion, but it's also limited in the manner in which it's conducted. If we're talking about frisking a person, it is generally limited to just a patting down, a physically touching of the outer garments of the person who is being detained. What we're doing is we're feeling for a weapon. It is not so much a visual search, although there can be a visual component to it, but it's more of a tactile type of a search. We're feeling around. It's a brief touching of the person's exterior, feeling for a weapon. And then once we feel something that we reasonably suspect to be a weapon, we now have the legal authority to remove that weapon, and however that is accomplished. But it's more of I call it a tactile search than more of a physical exploratory type of a search.
You've worked in law enforcement since 2004. Is there any other solid advice in any topic that you want to give?
One of the biggest issues when legal issues arise, like constitutional violations, like we have a search and seizure violation, or also I would also lump in there use of force issues. We've used excessive or unreasonable force because that's also a constitutional issue. I have found that I've worked on a lot of projects in my career where we've after the fact investigated situations, whether it's a complaint, whether it's a lawsuit has been implemented, and we're now after the fact figuring out what our liability exposure is. One common factor I see in most Fourth Amendment violation cases, whether it's force or just some illegal other search and seizure, can be traced back to the core transaction, the initial interaction between the officer and the citizen, where the current complaint arose. And many times it's a human relations problem. The officer has had his authority challenged by someone and takes offense at that. Let emotion more frequently dictate responses than reason and application of our training. So I think if I could encourage young officers, besides learning all the stuff that we have to learn, to make a concerted effort to exercise or improve your emotional intelligence, your ability to understand what pushes your buttons, and then recognize that and have a plan and act and prepare to respond to those kinds of provocations, because we all have them. It's the nature of being a human being. But I think a high level of emotional intelligence, which requires effort and self-awareness, I think would go a long way in mitigating some of these issues that we have: force, rudeness, those kinds of things that come out in complaints.
Absolutely profound. You hit the nail on the head on all regards. Thank you so much. Again.
I appreciate it. Appreciate that. Yeah.